with the rest of us.
But it is the Trump White House, so clarity is not
right.
always.
So what can you tell us about this stunning announcement?
Well, I can tell you that this is something that has been talked about for some time in terms of Secretary Tillerson and his future or lack thereof with the Trump administration. What is perhaps the biggest surprise of the morning is Gina Haspel. She is the one who was chosen by the president to become the next director of the CIA, if confirmed. She is a career CIA officer. She's been with the agency for about 30 years. And if she is confirmed, she would, of course, become the first woman to lead that agency. So that in itself is history-making. Vlad and Marie?
We hear she has a bit of a background, though, when it comes to the CIA, that she was sort of connected to some of these sort of black sites, secret prisons.
Well, that's correct. And that's something that came out last year that we asked the CIA about when she was picked to be the deputy director of the CIA. Yes, she was tied to the black sites, the torture programs. But when we asked the CIA about her past, they said that she was picked to be deputy director because she was the best person for the job. And then off the record and from sources that I've talked to in the past, they say that in her work for the CIA, she was just following orders. But this is an issue that will come up certainly when she goes through these confirmation hearings, her role in those black sites and the torture program. So it is something that is worth noting.
Jeff, I was sort of suggesting earlier that given the bumpy road that has faced the Secretary of State Rex Tillerson over his tenure, that Director Pompeo, given his background in the military, given his background as a member of Congress, and now running the CIA for over a year, might be well suited to this job as our chief diplomat, given that he has a keen understanding of some of the national security threats that face our nation and some of the opportunities that we can capitalize on. What's your take on that?
Well, that is true, but what is perhaps most important with this president is that Mike Pompeo, we know, has a close relationship to the president. He has become someone over the last year that the president has grown to trust, and that is probably why you see him moving up into this role as Secretary of State. And so the president, as we know, is someone who demands that a good, positive relationship, loyalty, if you will, from people who work around him. And Mike Pompeo over the last year is someone that he has come to depend on. And we've heard that from multiple sources since the president took office and since he counted on Mike Pompeo to become his CIA director. And Pompeo is someone who is there really daily with the president. He is there oftentimes when the president receives the daily briefing. So he is someone that the president counts on.
Just to bring our viewers up to speed, I mentioned that the president the Secretary of State was unaware of this until the rest of us found out that he was losing his job. So now we have sort of an official statement on the record from the department Undersecretary Steve Goldstein saying the secretary had every intention of staying because of the critical progress made in national security. He will miss his colleagues at the Department of State and the foreign ministers he has worked with throughout the world. The secretary did not speak to the president and is unaware of the reason, but he is grateful for the opportunity to serve and still believes strongly that public service is a noble calling. It's interesting because this statement did not need to be released.
Nope.
It's interesting that they're making it a point of letting the public know that the secretary did not intend to step down.
He's got nothing to lose by making this point, Jeff.
Well, yes, but if you look at the history of Tillerson with this administration, he was someone who really came from the establishment Republican Party. He was someone who was pushed by former Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice and Robert Gates, who worked in both the Obama administration and the George W. Bush administration. And so in a lot of ways, when the Trump administration began, Tillerson was an outsider, and he was someone that the establishment Republican Party viewed as more of a moderate influence, perhaps, on the Trump administration. So early on, there were signs of tension with this deferring view of this deferring worldview, if you will. but he was also picked perhaps because of his relationship with Vladimir Putin. As the head of Exxon Oil, he had developed over the years a relationship with the Russian president because of his business dealings in Russia. And so there were several positives to Rex Tillerson becoming Secretary of State, according to people who know him and people who have supported him over the years. And he, by many accounts, was seen as someone who could potentially be counted on to be a more moderate voice in this administration.
So, Jeff, stand by 1 second. I want to bring on CBS News State Department reporter Kylie Atwood. She's joining us on the phone to talk about this. Kylie, we just saw Margaret Brennan's note, the host of Face the Nation, suggesting that the Secretary of State Tillerson did not speak with the President of the United States and, in fact, found out about being ousted from his job at the same time that we, the public, did. What are you hearing about that? You're traveling with the Secretary.
Well, that's right. It's pretty shocking that the Secretary of State would find out that he's been fired via Twitter. But quite frankly, that's not really surprising given the fact that a lot of the Trump administration's foreign policy has been formed on Twitter. And the Secretary has mentioned time and time again that those tweets are tweets that are put out for him as he is trying to create policy. He sees, okay, can I work these in or can I not? Clearly, this is a situation where he has no choice but to work it in and then to go out the door. But Secretary Tillerson has been a person who has really forged a close relationship with the president over the past year. He's over there for lunch on a weekly basis. He talks to the president almost daily, State Department officials say. And I actually spoke with Undersecretary Steve Goldstein, who is at the State Department and works very closely with Secretary Tillerson. And I asked him, why was Tillerson cutting his trip to Africa short? He was here in Africa for about a week, and he decided to cut it. And just this morning, Steve told me that he was cutting it short in part to go back and sit down with the president to discuss North Korea. Clearly, that will no longer be the case.
Wow, that is really stunning. What has been the mood within the State Department over the past few months? We were talking earlier about, there have been a number of times when the president's tweets have been different than a statement that the secretary has issued to the media. What has been the general mood about the effectiveness of the State Department in this administration?
So there have been continued frustrations, I would say, at the State Department, just by nature of the fact that this is a White House that really concentrates power at the White House and decision-making at the White House. And that was very, very visible just this week. So when President Trump decided that he would indeed take the invitation from Kim Jong-un for a meeting, Tillerson was in Africa. It was 2:30 in the morning. He was in Addis Ababa, and he had to be up on the phone all night because that was a surprise decision that the president made pretty much unilaterally. And Tillerson said, that's a decision he made himself. He supported it. But that cuts out the State Department. It cuts out the State Department in giving the president the background, the research, the traditional, levels of diplomacy that an administration goes through that relies really heavily on the State Department. So there are definitely frustrations in the building. We'll see if a new secretary can kind of come in and be a bit more grandiose and try and employ the people at the State Department, make them feel like their expertise is valued, because right now that is not the case.
Kylie, so we were talking earlier to White House correspondent for the AP, Zeke Miller, and we were still trying to establish a timeline as to when this may have happened. And now, given that Margaret Brennan, and now you, of course, as well, having spoken to the Undersecretary Steve Goldstein on the record about this, understand that Tillerson found out about this through Twitter, which is how the rest of the world found out about this. And I'm curious then, were you surprised that Rex Tillerson came out so strongly against, or very, very pointedly made the suggestion yesterday that it was Russia that was involved in that attack on the former spies in the United Kingdom, which was very different from what we heard from the White House press briefing podium from Sarah Huckabee Sanders, and perhaps this may have been just one more twig on the back of the camel that the president just could not put up with anymore.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely possible. We did see Tillerson pretty forcefully blame the Russians and say that, those who initiated this attack and okayed this attack should be held responsible. So he was very aggressive in his language there, which, as you know, was different from the White House. But I would caveat that, because that has been something, this toughness on Russia, we've heard that a lot from the State Department. And we've seen, Heather Nauert, the State Department spokesperson, at the podium time and time again, just hammering Russia for what they're doing in Syria and what they're doing to, destabilize the entire Middle East with their backing of the Taliban in Afghanistan. I mean, the State Department has been time and time again pretty tough on Russia, so I'm not sure if that's, necessarily the one reason here, but it's definitely another point in which the White House and the State Department aren't necessarily in lockstep.
So it looks like we know that the president is expected to be heading to California today. Mm-hmm. He's going to be looking at some samples of the wall that have been put up. But he was out on the South Lawn, presumably leaving the White House to head out on this trip. And we don't have that video quite yet, but we do have some notes as to what he was asked. Often there's what we call a gaggle. There's a media out there throwing questions at him. And, of course, the top of the list is what's going on now. And here's a bit of what he had to say. He reiterated that he thought Mike Pompeo was a tremendous intellect that was needed in the State Department, and that he was the right man for this job, a good person for the job. And he said that he wishes Rex Tillerson well, and that Gina Haspel, who's appointed to take over for Pompeo, would be the first woman director of the CIA and an outstanding person. And he says that Rex Tillerson didn't do anything wrong, or he was asked whether or not Rex Tillerson did anything wrong. And what he said was that, that they had been talking for a long time, that he got along well with Rex Tillerson, but they disagreed on some things. For example, he said the Iran deal he thinks is terrible. Rex Tillerson thinks the Iran deal is okay, according to the president. And they weren't really thinking the same. And he says that Mike Pompeo and the president, we have similar thought process. These are sort of notes that we're getting from the reporters that are out there, and that's one of the things that we talked about, Vlad, is that Pompeo and President Trump may be more in line philosophically when it comes to the role of the State Department. And
Kylie, it's to Emery's point. It's not always clear if you want a cabinet surrounded by yes men and yes women. I mean, it's especially given the many challenges facing this country right now. I get it. The president likes people that are loyal to him, but there are challenges facing this country and our allies that are not necessarily tied to simple loyalty.
Right, and Tillerson has, mentioned time and time again that he's the person who presents a whole host of options to Trump when he's making decisions. We'll have to see the case of Pompeo, who has Trump, it's a mind meld with the president. He thinks he knows what he wants. Is he still going to be looking at these whole host of options? Well, one would hope as a Secretary of State. But I also want to note that, even though Tillerson didn't know about this, one to be asking over the next few days is, what did Pompeo know about this?
Yeah,
right.
For an interview on Face the Nation over the weekend, and Margaret Brennan asked, basically, who's going to be the diplomat leading the negotiations and the planning for President Trump's meeting with Kim Jong-un? And he was pretty evasive. He said, I'm going to leave.
All right, Kylie, stand by, Kylie. Kylie, stand by. Let's listen to the president from moments ago.
Tremendous intellect. We're always on the same wavelength.